As I reflected on this gospel reading for the past week, I found myself singing the first line of our communion hymn over and over again in my head. Abide with me, fast falls the eventide. That word, abide, just really stuck out to me for some reason. Maybe it's because Jesus uses it like 100 times in this short 8-verse passage. But it also made me think of one of my internship supervisor's favorite movies, The Big Lebowski. My supervisor still sends me memes and GIFs about this movie to this day. In the movie, Jeff Bridges stars as the main character, Jeffrey Lebowski, who is better known by his nickname, The Dude. And if you ever reach the day where, Lutheranism just isn't cutting it for you anymore, fear not, because there is indeed something called Dudism, or more formally, the Church of the Latter-day Dude, the central theological tenets of which are all based on quotes from the movie. Now, I know it's not usually a good idea to advertise for the competition, but I just couldn't help it. The official logo is a yin-yang symbol, but instead of one dot in each half, there are 3 to resemble a bowling ball, because much of the movie takes place in a bowling alley. I'm not sure if they do sacraments, but I would assume that White Russians would be involved somehow. And Dudism encourages its practitioners to go with the flow, to be cool-headed and take it easy in the face of life's difficulties. And all of these teachings are summed up in the most iconic quote from the movie, "The Dude abides." Hence why I associated it with today's reading. For the Dude, abiding meant going with the flow, taking life's ups and downs as they come and, making your way through the best you can. And while that actually is some pretty good advice, the way that Jesus uses the word is slightly different. The Greek word that appears in the original manuscript of the passage that we have as our reading for today is meno, and it can be translated as abide, remain, or stay. What's particularly interesting about this sentence grammatically is that Jesus says, "Abide in me as I abide in you." It contains both an invitation for us to abide in Jesus, as well as the assurance that he already abides in us. That part isn't in question, it simply is. Much like the new commandment that he gives to his disciples on the night of his betrayal, love one another as I love you, where we are invited to love each other while at the same time being reminded of the fact that Jesus already loves us. Now, in addition to the communion hymn, I also found myself singing our hymn of the day, "I Want Jesus to Walk With Me," in part because I had just read a great article in the Christian Century magazine that references the song, but also because I feel like there are some pretty strong parallels between Jesus abiding in us and Jesus walking with us. The article that I mentioned was written by retired ELCA pastor Heidi Newmark, who talks about how her response to that first line of the song is an emphatic yes. I do want Jesus to walk with me. And I agree with her. I want that too. I want to know that Jesus will be there for me no matter what I am going through. That notion of accompaniment is one of the core pieces of our Lutheran theology. The fact that we have a God who would take on flesh for our sake, experiencing everything that it means to be human, means that we can be assured of the fact that God truly understands everything that we experience throughout the course of our lives. The good and the bad, the ups and the downs, victories and defeats, strikes and gutter balls, to tie it back to the Dude. Jesus is there to celebrate with us, to mourn with us, to pick us up when we have fallen down, and we are comforted by the promise of his abiding Spirit. Comforted by the fact that no matter what, we are never truly alone. So of course, we want Jesus to walk with us, to abide in us. But the question then becomes, as Reverend Newmark points out in her article, do we want to walk with and abide in Jesus? The word abide appears elsewhere in the Bible, most notably in the Psalms. Psalm 61 reads, "Hear my cry, O God, listen to my prayer. From the end of the earth I call to you when my heart is faint. Lead me to the rock that is higher than I, for you are my refuge, a strong tower against the enemy. Let me abide in your tent forever. Find refuge under the shelter of your wings." This notion of abiding in the tent of God was twofold. First, it offered protection. Abiding in the tent of God meant that you were safe, protected from all evils, but it also came with certain responsibilities. You were expected to honor God and to do what is right. Throughout the Gospels, Jesus talks about the cost of discipleship, not because we must suffer for our salvation, but because living out the values that Jesus embodied very often puts us at odds with the values and teachings of the world around us. Walking with and abiding in Jesus will take us to places that we might never have chosen to go on our own. It will bring us into contact with people that we might never have met were we left to our own devices, because Jesus walked at the margins of our society. He ministered to the sick, the broken, the outcast, the oppressed. He cared for those who were most in need of hearing that they are loved, those who are most in need of God's grace, mercy, and forgiveness. So to walk with Jesus means bearing God's love into the hurting places of the world and offering God's grace, mercy, and forgiveness to those who need it most. It means facing down systems of power in this world that use violence and force to oppress and control. It means even challenging the purpose of religion, realizing that the point is not to follow all of the rules perfectly, but rather to care for the least of these and make sure that everyone knows that they are perfectly loved. The idea of Jesus walking with us, abiding in us, that sounds quite lovely, comforting, reassuring, but for us to walk with and abide in him, that sounds hard and uncomfortable and maybe even dangerous at times. And in part, it's hard because we know that we will be changed as a result, pruned, as our gospel text for today speaks of. Now, obviously, when I think of pruning, I think of gardening or agriculture, which makes sense since the metaphor that Jesus uses in our reading is all about vines and branches. And it turns out that there actually is a lot of thought and technique that goes into the process of pruning. At least that's what I learned via Facebook. The algorithm that decides which posts it shows me must be so confused because I just have the most random interests. But I saw a post that was all about pruning technique and how important it is to properly decide which branches you cut, where to cut them, which direction you should cut so as to allow for proper drainage and flow of nutrients. And when it was all laid out in a nice, neat infographic, it looked pretty easy. But then they showed me this overgrown rose bush and asked me to apply that information to what should be trimmed on that bush, and I was at a complete loss as to where I should begin. And yet, even though it is complicated and complex, it is also vital to the health of a plant. You actually need to trim and thin and cut your plants if you want to encourage and facilitate them to thrive and flourish, a notion that seems a little counterintuitive. When I was growing up in Half Moon Bay, we had a number of fruit trees in our backyard, and I remember how odd it was that we would go out and pick certain unripe apples and plums from the cluster. And I thought, shouldn't the goal be to have as many of them on the tree as possible to maximize the number that you eventually harvest? But in reality, you need to thin out those clusters. Otherwise, the fruit won't have the space or the nutrients needed to grow to full size. It's much better to have 2 or 3 fully ripened apples than a cluster of 7, all of which are small and edible. Something that I think that applies to the fruits that we produce as well. And if we are going to grow and flourish and develop into the healthy and thriving individuals that God intends for us to be, we will, somewhat counterintuitively, need to be pruned. But what does that mean exactly? Well, I'll tell you what it doesn't mean. It doesn't mean that if we aren't good enough, or don't produce enough fruit, or do enough good deeds, that we will be chopped off entirely from the vine of Jesus Christ and cast into that scary-sounding brush fire that he talked about. Historically, that is usually how this passage has been interpreted. That unless we abide in Jesus and follow through in regards to all that entails, we will be pruned and cast into the fire of God's righteous judgment. But what if Jesus actually meant, like he said, that we are the branches, plural? That would mean that each person represents a cluster of branches, and that pruning would mean trimming and getting rid of individual, unhelpful branches, the parts of ourselves that clog up and congest and limit our growth. This pruning that Jesus is talking about is not the wholesale discarding of people, but rather a refinement process that helps us to become the people God intends us to be. It is a process that helps us to grow and thrive and flourish. What is it that needs to be pruned from our lives, from your life? Maybe it's fear, or selfishness, or greed. How about envy, or the need to always be right, or the desire to always be in control? What is it that stands in the way of us walking with and abiding in Jesus in the same way that he walks with and abides in us? The good news in all of this is that we don't need to be perfectly pruned before we begin to walk with and abide in Jesus. In fact, that would kind of defeat the purpose if you expected that. That pruning and refining and growth that God intends for us, it happens along the way. But how do we get started? The idea of walking with and abiding in Jesus can seem like a pretty daunting and overwhelming task. Just like staring at that overgrown rose bush, how are we supposed to even know where to begin? How do we begin to love one another in the same way that Jesus loves us? How do we follow Jesus out into the corners and the margins of this world when society tells us that we should avoid those places at all costs? We do it one step at a time. The journey of 1,000 miles begins with a single step. I recently completed the most intricate and complicated Lego set that I have ever built in my entire life. It was Vincent van Gogh's Starry Night, and this is what it looks like pre-assembly. It's hard to tell, but there are over 1,500 pieces in those bags. The set was actually a gift that was given to me by the family of Dee Rothenberger after her funeral. I had mentioned in a sermon a number of years ago how much I loved playing with Lego sets as a kid, and how when I moved to San Diego, I had 4 storage bins that were filled to overflowing. That has since been pruned down to just 2, I will say. But after that sermon, Dee would always email me pictures of all of the new Lego sets that she built. And the box for this set sat in the corner of my office for months. And every time I looked at it, I thought to myself, I really should build that one of these days. But the size and the complexity of the task was always just felt too daunting. And soon I would move on to other things. Until finally, my wife, Alyssa, suggested and encouraged that I just start it, do it in stages. It ended up taking me over a week to finish, but eventually all of these bags were transformed into this beautiful piece of art. And I got there one step at a time. How do we walk with Jesus? One step at a time. And you want to hear something awesome? You've already taken the first step simply by being here today. And in reality, some of you are miles down the road at this point. But no matter how far along the path you are, what happens next is the same for each and every one of us. We take one more step. We make one small choice to live in accordance with Jesus' teachings. We do one small act of kindness, one little deed of service, one small gift of generosity, and then another, and another, and another, until our awkward, staggering gait becomes a smooth and confident stride as we walk with and abide in Jesus, knowing that he walks with and abides in us as well. Amen.